Let's end our discussion of type identity theory by considering three arguments that identity theorists can and have offered in support of their view, and then consider three arguments that theorists can and have offered against type identity theory, using that distinction between analytic and synthetic truths. Type identity theorists argue that the traditional dualist arguments, like the argument from Leibniz's law or the argument from introspection, that seek to thwart identifying the mental and the physical, those arguments, they claim, don't apply to these co-referential identity statements that they propose. And they offer a specific explanation for the referential opacity in the cases that they're considering. The co-referential identity statements that they depend upon for their reductions are contingent synthetic truths. Hence, they're not likely to be referentially transparent. In fact, they have to be discovered, usually through relatively lengthy and complicated empirical investigation. The inapplicability argument clears away obstacles to acceptance of type identity theory, but it doesn't provide us with much of a substantive reason to accept the type identity theory. For that, theorists depend upon a different argument, the reductive analogy arguments. Type identity theorists use the reductive analogy arguments to support their claims that mental terms and categories will be reduced to physical terms and categories via these contingent synthetic identity statements that claim co-reference between the categories, precisely because that is the general framework for many significant and important instances of scientific reduction throughout the history of science. Thus, type identity theorists will say, look, object color is just a phenomenological manifestation of the underlying physical category of surface reflectance, and that this has been discovered because scientists were able to equate, co-refer object color and surface reflectance. Temperature of a gas is just the mean kinetic energy. Sound is just the compression waves traveling through the atmosphere. The pitch of the sound is just the oscillatory frequency of those waves. Lightning is just the sudden large-scale discharge of electrons between clouds or between clouds and the surface of the Earth. Water is just the molecule with the structure of two hydrogens bonded to one oxygen. All of these cases, the identity theorists will claim, are cases of contingent synthetic discoveries of co-reference between phenomenal manifestations and underlying physical categories. Mental to physical reductions will just be additional instances of this general type of scientific discovery, just as useful and no more problematic than any other instance. A third and final argument that type identity theorists can offer in support of their view is what I call the semantic cake argument. The semantic cake argument essentially notes that identity theory renders mental terms consistent with monistic physicalism without the downside of rejecting or denying those aspects of the pre-theoretic meanings of mental terms that seem prima facie inconsistent with physicalism. As a result, the initial identifications do no violence to our ordinary conceptions, though they might ultimately serve to transform those ordinary conceptions, rendering them more consistent, more elaborate, and so on. What about arguments that theorists might offer against type identity theory? We're already familiar with two of the traditional arguments offered against equating the mind with the body: the argument from introspection and the argument from Leibniz's law. These two arguments really share a common strategy. Specifically, they locate particular phenomenal manifestations with the mental that aren't obviously manifestations associated with any physical category. Based on that difference, they conclude that the mental cannot be the physical. Now, the response that type identity theorists offer to these arguments is to note that kind of difference only matters if we're using meaning equivalence as the basis for identifications and the basis for our reductions. There are two new arguments against type-type identity theory that are offered up by Davidson and then by functionalists like Fodor or Bloch. Davidson objects to type-type identity theories on the grounds that anomalousness of the mental will result in anomalousness of the physical if type-type identity theories are true. Now, when I say that the mental is anomalous, all I mean is that there aren't any strict deterministic laws that relate mental terms to mental terms. And by a strict deterministic law, I just mean a law that specifies an exceptionless universal relationship such that with any given set of unique initial conditions, I can always use those conditions together with the law to determine the unique outcome. Davidson says, look, the mental admits of exceptions. Psychological laws are generalizations that are full of exceptions. And if they are full of exceptions, then if we have type identifications, exceptionless equations between mental terms and physical terms, the anomalies in the psychological laws will be transferred through those exceptionless type identities to the physical terms and will hence reveal anomalies in the physical laws as well. But there are no anomalies in the physical laws, and as a result, type identity theory can't possibly be true. Functionalists like Bloch or Fodor offer a different argument against type reductionism. They challenge the implied one-to-one identities of type theory by mounting an argument for multiple instantiations. Surely, they'll say, it must be possible, for instance, to have pains without C fibers, or C fibers without pains. Just as we can have a doorstop be instantiated through any number of physical materials or even variations in design or physical principles, surely pains could be instantiated in multiple different ways. And if you believe, for example, that invertebrates feel pain, then you probably accept multiple realization because invertebrates don't have a single brain. They don't have a central nervous system. So the mechanisms and structures that we associate with pain in vertebrates don't translate to the ganglion regions within invertebrates. And as a result, if there are pains in each of these kinds of creatures, they must be instantiated in different ways. If type identity theory were true, there would have to be a single way to have a pain.